Hey everyone, Jelica here from aprettyfix.com and welcome back to my channel. So I just released a small batch of circle weaving starter kits in my Etsy shop in all sorts of lovely color palettes. I'll leave a link in the description box below if you do want to check those out. And I thought in time for the release, I really wanted to update my original circle weaving for beginners video. If you haven't seen that, I'll leave a link below as well. Today specifically, I wanted to focus on the hardest part, which is how to warp and wrap a hoop. Now, it's really important to get this part right because then you have a framework on which you can weave and create all sorts of lovely designs. And whether you're using a metal hoop, a wooden hoop, or an embroidery hoop, which is what we're going to be using for this particular tutorial, the principles are all the same. So if you've been wanting to try your hand at circle weaving, but you've been really intimidated by this part of the process, don't worry, I'll be taking you step by step in today's video. So these are the supplies you'll need for this project: an embroidery hoop or a wooden or a metal hoop of some kind, cotton warp string, a spool or some stick of similar size, measuring tape, a pair of scissors, also a tapestry needle. I like to use a bent tip tapestry needle. I find it is easier to work with, but any tapestry needle is fine. A pencil, as well as macrame cord, which you'll use to wrap the hoop. I like to work with 3mm, but any thickness will work for this project. Because I'm using an embroidery hoop for this particular project, we're going to have to separate the outer ring from the inner ring. And if you've never done this before or never used an embroidery hoop, it's really quite easy. You just have to unscrew the outside of it. And when you do this, it actually loosens the exterior ring and it enables you to pop out the interior ring. And then you can pull the two rings apart. Now simply set aside the outer ring and we'll be working with the inner ring. So grabbing your measuring tape, you're going to measure the circumference of the interior ring. So mine measures 24 inches in circumference. If you do happen to purchase the kits from my shop, this is the exact embroidery hoop that I'm using. And simply mark out each inch around the entire circumference of the hoop until you reach the end. Now don't worry about the marks that you have on the hoop because in step 2 of the project we'll be wrapping all of this using the macrame cord, so all of this will be covered in the final piece. So now we're going to be warping our circular loom. And for those of you who are new to weaving, the warp is the framework or the foundation of any weaving. The warp is made up of various strings that hold all of your woven yarns together. And in this case, the spokes on the circular loom represent the warp. Now for this tutorial, we're going to be warping the hoop before we wrap it, but you can actually do this in the reverse order, particularly when you're using a single hoop. It's all based on your personal preference. But when using an embroidery hoop, this is the method that I prefer. So to create our warp, we're going to be using warp string. Warp string is typically 100% cotton. It's durable, it's flexible, which is what you want when you're weaving. So grabbing a bunch of that cotton string, we're now going to measure out how much we need. For each point we marked around the circumference of the circle, in this case we marked 24, you'll measure 24 lengths of string using the diameter of the circle as our measurement. And that's simply because we're essentially measuring out the number of spokes we're going to be creating. So grabbing your warp string, begin to measure 24 lengths across. So that's 1, 2, 3, you get the idea. And continue that until you've measured 24 lengths. Now once you've measured 24 full lengths, you'll want to add 2 additional lengths just to give yourself a little extra wiggle room for knots and a few other things that you're going to be doing. So now we're going to be warping our circular loom. I really like to use a spool because of the edges, and that's because the edges will prevent the string from slipping right off. If you're buying my kits, you'll receive the spool already preloaded with the appropriate amount of yarn and then some. I do add quite a bit. You could probably create a couple of projects with it. But if you don't have that, or if you're not getting the kits, grab a small dowel or a small stick that's about, I'd say, at least 3 inches to make this an easier process. So now you can begin to warp the hoop. Just locate one of the marked points along your hoop, doesn't really matter which one, and you're going to tie a double knot at that spot. And just be sure the knot ends up on the interior side of the hoop. So now we can begin warping our hoop, or creating spokes essentially. Using the marked points around the circumference, we're going to be using that as our guide and making sure that we pull the string directly to the opposite point on the hoop. Essentially, we'll be wrapping the string around each point along the way. So to begin warping or creating your spokes, you're going to feed the spool into the interior of the ring and then pull the string around the outside. The first warp string should cut right through the center of the hoop. Then holding onto the spool, feed it back into the interior of the ring towards the lower left side. Then bring the spool around the outside, making sure that the string wraps around the next point you have marked, just to the left of that first string. Now wrap the string around and then feed the spool back into the interior, this time going towards the right. Find the next point that you've marked around the hoop and make sure to wrap the string around that point. So this is essentially the start to warping your hoop, going left to right to left to right until you make it all the way around the entire hoop. But we're going to repeat this a couple of more times just so you can get the hang of it. So again, pull the spool down into the interior of the ring, going towards the left side. Find the next marked point along the hoop, wrap the string around, and then again, pull it towards the interior of the hoop, this time moving towards the right. Now find the next marked point to the right and wrap the string around. And continue repeating, going left, then back over towards the right, then back down towards the left. And that's an easy way to remember how you can properly wrap the hoop. Always using those marked points around the hoop to guide the process. Now, from time to time, you're going to kind of assess things and make little adjustments, making sure that the strings are matching up with the marked points. But you can do that as you move along. And for those of you who are using hoops of various sizes, maybe bigger or smaller than the one that I'm using, when you mark your 1-inch spokes around the circumference, you might end up with an odd number, say 25 inches or 27 inches. In that case, when you're creating the first spoke, you will likely be wrapping the string between the marked points. They're still great as a guide and will help you get all the way around. But if you find yourself a little bit stuck, or you need a little extra help, or you just want to see a demonstration of that, then feel free to take a look at my original Circle Weaving for Beginners, which was a Facebook Live video demonstration. Now, once you reach the last marked point along the way, you should end up right next to your starter knot. So at this point, you'll have a series of spokes, and it looks a little bit messy, but what we're going to do is pull all of those spokes together to form a center point. And this is what is going to make weaving much easier. So for this last spoke, you're going to continue pulling the warp string down as you normally would. And you can choose any one of these spaces in between along the bottom. And then you're going to cinch upwards, and you can see how it forms a center point. And if you flip it over, you can see that it should look pretty much the same as it does along the front. Now, although we've cinched it together, you can see there are still some loose warp strings, and we're going to really want to tighten those up or bundle them together. So I'm going to push the spool up somewhere along the side so that I can kind of cinch that together and bundle that center point up as well. So I'm going to feed it again through any one of the spokes along the side just to pull it together a bit more tightly. Now here's a close-up of my center point. You can see the warp string is coming up from the bottom and along the sides to bundle it together and to form kind of a thicker center. Yours may look a little bit different. Don't worry, it doesn't have to look exactly like mine, but it does give you an example to work from. So the final step to warping your hoop is to join the last string to the starter knot. So right now I'm still holding the spool behind the hoop. So I'm just going to tuck it through one of the spaces from behind and continue to pull upwards. So I'm still kind of bundling those fibers together along the center. And I'm then just going to pull it all the way up to join the starter knot. And the reason for this is because when you wrapped the warp string around, you created essentially double spokes. So you've got a spoke on one side of the hoop and a spoke on the other side of the hoop. So that by joining that last warp string to the starter knot, you've completed all of the double spokes that have gone around the hoop. Now you can just snip off the warp string and then tie the end to the tail of the starter knot. Now you don't have to worry too much about the tail. As long as it's located on the interior side of the hoop, you should be fine. So now you're ready to wrap the hoop itself. For this tutorial, we're going to be using woven macrame cord. My personal preference is to use a 3mm, but really whatever thickness you wish is perfectly fine. We're going to be using this neutral colored one that's readily available in most craft stores. Now, if you're using a regular metal or wooden hoop, you can start to wrap right away. But for this tutorial, we're going to be using an embroidery hoop. So we're going to first reattach the exterior ring, and then we're going to wrap around both rings. I often like using an embroidery hoop because it provides a natural place to hang your project right along the top. It also provides that really cool vintage vibe, but a regular metal hoop will do. Now to reattach, you just tighten the screw along the top. As you do, it'll tighten the exterior ring around the interior ring. Now you should be fine using your fingers, but you can always grab a small pair of pliers, in this case needle nose pliers, and just tighten that last bit up. But because we're going to be wrapping both rings together, I wouldn't worry about that too much. Okay, now we're ready to wrap. Now for my circle weaving kits, I've already pre-measured the amount of cord that you will need to wrap the entire project. In this case, I'm just pulling out a bundle and demonstrating that even if you run out at a certain point, you don't have to worry at all. You just pick up again where you left off. So in order to start wrapping, just grab one end and tuck it in underneath the interior ring. And you're going to wrap around that end piece. I'm not going to be gluing it to the ring. You can do that if you want to, but I find it's an unnecessary step to this process. So I've just tucked it in between the double spokes just to make it a little bit easier. And then just slowly begin to wrap the cord around both rings and that tail to secure it in place. Now, once you reach the first set of double spokes, it's really easy. You simply continue wrapping on the other side of those spokes. And that's really it. And you can just continue wrapping along this way until that tail end of the macrame cord is completely covered and secured to your hoop. Now you can continue wrapping until you completely run out of your macrame cord. Once you have about 4 inches remaining, then you're going to tuck that tail back into the wrapped cords. So grab a tapestry needle and simply thread the end of the cord through. So the idea here is to grab the end of the macrame cord and feed it back into the portion of the hoop that's been wrapped. So I'm going to be taking maybe 3 or 4 cords, and I'm just going to feed the tip of the needle underneath those wrapped cords and push all the way through. Now make sure to give it a good tug before snipping off the end. Now that little piece gets covered at the end once you've actually woven on your hoop, but you can always snip it even closer. Just be real careful that you don't snip your cords along the way. Now at this point, you simply pick up where you left off. You begin wrapping just the way that you started at the beginning by grabbing the tail of your macrame cord, tucking it into the interior of the hoop, and then continue wrapping your hoop. So once you reach the end and you're closer to the top of your embroidery hoop, you're going to continue wrapping as you normally would. Just make sure to avoid the screw along the top, and there's lots of space between the screw and the exterior hoop, so you can just continue wrapping by slipping it underneath like that. When you reach the middle portion along the top, what you'll notice is that there is a gap. And you can do one of two things. You can either continue wrapping, which means that you'll just be wrapping around that interior hoop, or if you want, you can add a little bit of depth there that's missing because of the gap. So if you decide to do that, you can just cut a piece of macrame cord and simply wrap around it. Now you can also choose to glue that little piece onto the embroidery hoop, but I don't think it's necessary. Once you've wrapped your cord around it and secured the end of your cord, it's not going to impact things very much. So alternatively, if the cord you're using isn't very thick, you can always add a small piece of wood or something that won't give very much, or just forgo it entirely. It's really based on your personal preference. But I wanted to give you some ideas on what you can do in that gap. Of course, if you're not using an embroidery hoop, or you're just using the interior of the embroidery hoop or another wooden hoop or metal hoop, you won't be encountering that gap or that issue at all. So keep that in mind when you're creating your piece. So once you reach the end, you'll simply tuck that tail in just as you did before. And just a quick tip, if that macrame cord is a bit too thick to fit into a regular tapestry needle's eye, I always like to just loosen those fibers, and then it makes it a whole lot easier to begin to load that cord into that eye, because you've just got some fibers to work with that are flat, and then you can just push the macrame cord in just enough so that it catches. Now you can secure the end of your macrame cord back into the wrapped portion. This part always feels a little persnickety, I guess. So just be patient with yourself as you work your tapestry needle through, and make sure to tighten any cords that loosened along the way. So this is how your finished piece should look, wrapped and warped and ready to be woven with all of those beautiful, lovely designs. Don't forget to check out my original circle weaving for beginners linked below, where I show you how to weave on a circular loom. And let me know if you want to see more videos on weaving in the round and different weaving techniques for weaving on a circular loom. All right, see you guys in the next video.